If you like standing outside so much, then you can sleep out there tonight.
Margaret's voice rang out with bitterness just before the wooden door slammed shut right in front of Grace. The sound of the lock clicking into place was cold and final, enough to make her heart feel as if it had stopped beating. Outside, heavy rain poured down mercilessly. The icy raindrops quickly soaked her hair, her clothes, and the hands she had wrapped tightly around her stomach. Grace stood frozen beneath the porch, unable to believe what had just happened, only a few minutes earlier. She had still believed this was her home, and now she had been pushed outside like a stranger. Trembling, Grace stepped closer to the door and knocked softly. "Mom, please open the door." "I don't feel well." There was no answer, only the sound of rain pounding harder and harder against the roof. She tried knocking again. "Mom, please." But this time, what answered her was laughter from inside. A laugh that sent a chill through Grace's entire body. Margaret was laughing. The woman who was supposed to be family was laughing while watching her stand alone in the rain. Grace closed her eyes. Her throat tightened. The most painful thing was not the cold rain. It was not even being thrown out of the house. The most painful thing was realizing that someone could be that cruel to you while still calling you family. If the story had ended there, Grace would probably have become just another unfortunate woman forgotten by life. But life always has its own way of continuing stories that people believe have already ended. 6 years later, beneath another cold rain, much like the one. From that night, an elderly woman stood in front of the tall iron gates of a luxurious mansion. Her hair had turned much grayer. Her face was filled with exhaustion and despair. She stood there for a long time, rainwater running down her face, unable to tell whether she was crying or simply drenched by the storm. That woman was none other than Margaret, and beyond those gates stood a house that belonged to Grace, the daughter-in-law she had once pushed out the door. But this time, everything had changed. The person standing outside the gate was no longer Grace, and the person who had the power to decide whether the door would be opened was no longer Margaret. Some people believe that just because they are family, they have the right to hurt others. They believe their relatives will always forgive them, will always endure, will always come back no matter how badly they are treated. But life never forgets what people have done. It may remain silent for years, it may move more slowly than we expect, but it remembers every tear, every wound, and every door that was closed in the face of someone who needed love the most. The person who pushes you out the door today may be the same person knocking on your door tomorrow. And that is also Grace's story, a young orphan girl who grew up in poverty, always believing that if she treated others with kindness, she would one day be loved in return. But she was about to learn a far more painful lesson, that not everyone who is called family knows how to treat you like family. Grace had never been someone favored by life. Her father died when she was too young to clearly remember his face. A few years later, her mother also passed away after a long illness, leaving her alone to learn how to grow up much sooner than other children. While her friends were protected by their parents, Grace had to start working at an early age to support herself. There were days when she walked miles just to save bus fare. There were nights when she studied and worked so much that she fell asleep at her desk. But no matter how difficult life became, Grace held on to one simple belief, that if she treated others with kindness, one day she would be loved too. And it was that belief that made her fall in love with Michael. He was not wealthy or glamorous, but he always presented himself as a sincere man. During the first years of their relationship, Michael would often hold her hand and say, "From now on, you're not alone anymore." Whenever Grace worried about the future, he would smile and reassure her, "I'll always protect you." Those were the words an orphan girl like Grace had always longed to hear. So when Michael proposed, she did not hesitate. She believed she had finally found a family. But Grace did not know that the greatest challenge in that marriage would not be money or the hardships of life. Its name was Margaret. From the very first time they met, Margaret made no effort to hide her disappointment. She looked Grace up and down and then asked questions that made the atmosphere in the room feel suffocating. She asked where Grace's family was. She asked what her parents had done for a living. She asked whether she owned any property, and when she learned that Grace had almost nothing to her name, the look in her eyes changed immediately. In Margaret's eyes, a girl with a background like Grace's could never be worthy of her son. After the wedding, everything became even clearer. Margaret never yelled at Grace or physically mistreated her. She did something worse. She made Grace feel like an outsider in her own home. Whenever relatives came to visit, Margaret always found a way to bring up Grace's circumstances. Once during a family dinner, she set her glass down heavily on the table and said in front of everyone, "My son could have married a doctor." The entire table fell silent. Grace lowered her head. But Margaret continued and said, "He married someone who has nothing." Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances as no one spoke up for her. No one said that Margaret had gone too far. And what hurt Grace the most was that Michael remained seated there. He heard everything, yet he stayed silent. If the story had ended with those sarcastic remarks, Grace might still have found the strength to endure. But Margaret never seemed willing to stop. One afternoon, when the two of them were alone in the kitchen, Margaret looked at Grace and coldly asked, "What has your family contributed to this family?" Grace stood frozen. She wanted to answer that she had brought love. She had brought sincerity. She had brought sacrifice for Michael, but she knew those things held no value in Margaret's eyes. That night, Grace cried in their bedroom. She told her husband everything that had happened and hoped he would stand by her side, but Michael simply sighed and pulled her into his arms. "My mother is old. Don't take it personally." Grace silently looked at the man in front of her. His answer sounded gentle, but over time she began to realize that it was not protection. It was avoidance. Every time his mother hurt her, Michael chose silence. Every time she was humiliated, he told her to let it go, and little by little. Grace began to understand that the most frightening thing in a family is not the person who openly hates you. It is the person who sees your suffering and still chooses to do nothing. After nearly 4 years of marriage, Grace finally received the good news she had been waiting for so long. When she saw the results in the doctor's office, she burst into tears. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of happiness from a woman who had been disappointed many times, yet kept hoping. On the way home, Grace held the ultrasound picture tightly against her chest. She believed that this baby would change everything. She believed that Margaret might hate her, but would love her grandchild. She believed that a child would make this family gentler. And most importantly, she believed Michael would be happy. That evening, when she showed the ultrasound picture to her husband, Grace had never seen him smile so much. Michael wrapped his arms around her and said, "We're finally going to have a baby." Grace smiled through her tears. At that moment, she thought that all her previous suffering had been worth it, but she was wrong. If anything changed after Grace became pregnant, it was that Margaret became even more cruel than before. She was not happy at all, as Grace had imagined. On the contrary, she treated Grace's pregnancy as another reason to criticize her. Every morning, Grace still had to wake up very early to prepare meals, clean the house, and do the laundry. Whenever she sat down for a few minutes to rest because she was exhausted, Margaret would immediately say coldly, "You're pregnant, not a patient. Why are you sitting there?" Some days Grace's morning sickness was so severe that she could barely eat. Yet Margaret still piled household chores in front of her. One day, when she saw Grace holding her stomach and sitting down because she felt dizzy, Margaret looked at her with irritation and said, "Ever since you got pregnant, you've become even lazier." What hurt even more was that Michael was rarely there to witness any of it. His job often required him to leave early and return home late. And whenever Grace tried to tell him about it, the answer she received was always the same. "My mother is old, don't take it personally." Grace did not know how to explain to her husband that what was hurting her was not just the words. It was the feeling that she had never truly been accepted by this family. The following months passed heavily. Margaret began openly referring to the baby as a burden. One evening during dinner, she slammed her chopsticks down on the table and said, "It's exhausting enough having to support one person in this house. Now there's going to be another mouth to feed." Grace froze. Instinctively, she placed a hand over her stomach as if trying to protect her unborn child, but Margaret continued. I just hope it doesn't turn out like its mother. The entire table fell silent. Michael heard every word. He knew his wife was fighting back tears, but in the end he lowered his head and continued eating as if nothing had happened. And that silence hurt Grace more than any insult ever could. Then the fateful night finally arrived, a night of heavy rain that filled the entire city with the sound of howling wind and thunder. Michael was away on a business trip in another state. Only Grace and Margaret were at home. Since that afternoon, Grace had not been feeling well. She had a high fever, her head was spinning, and she could barely stay on her feet. When Margaret called her downstairs to mop the floor, Grace tried to make her way down the stairs, holding on to the railing because of the dizziness. She looked at her mother-in-law and spoke softly. Mom, I don't feel well. Can I rest today? But instead of showing concern, Margaret immediately became angry. Don't feel well, she let out a contemptuous laugh. You think being pregnant is a license to do nothing? Grace tried to explain, but Margaret did not want to listen. The criticism became harsher and harsher. The argument quickly spiraled out of control, and then something happened that Grace never thought was possible. Margaret grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the front door. Grace panicked. What are you doing? But Margaret did not answer. She opened the door and shoved Grace out onto the porch into the freezing rain. A bag of clothes was thrown after her and landed in a puddle in the yard. Trembling Grace clung to the doorframe. Mom, please don't do this. But there was not a trace of mercy in Margaret's eyes. You don't deserve to be in this house. She spoke coldly. Grace burst into tears. I have nowhere to go. Margaret looked directly at her and replied in the cruelest voice imaginable. Get out. A second later, the door slammed shut. The sound of the lock echoed like a final sentence. Grace stood in the rain, her entire body trembling from cold and despair. She knocked on the door. No one opened it. She called Michael's name hopelessly. Even though she knew he was far away, no one answered. She called for her mother-in-law again. Still no response other than the rain and the thunder. There was nothing. For the first time in her life, Grace understood what it felt like to be completely abandoned. No family, no shelter, no one on her side. She tried to walk through the darkness. But her legs grew weaker with every step. Everything in front of her began to blur. Just a few minutes later, Grace collapsed beside the road beneath the freezing rain, and then darkness completely consumed her. When Grace opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the cold white light on the hospital's ceiling. Everything around her was blurry. She tried to move, but her entire body ached as though it had been crushed. For a few seconds, she could not remember what had happened. Then the rain, the slamming door, the cold sound of the lock, Margaret's face, it all came rushing back at once. Grace immediately placed a hand on her stomach. But the familiar feeling she had carried with her for months was gone. A terrifying fear ran down her spine. At that moment, a doctor walked into the room. One look at his eyes was enough for Grace to understand. Even so, she forced herself to ask in a trembling voice, "Where is my baby?" The room fell silent for a few seconds. Then the doctor gently lowered his head. "We are very sorry. Those 4 simple words destroyed everything that remained inside Grace." She did not cry immediately. She did not scream. She did not react. She simply stared into empty space as if her soul had been taken from her, the baby she had waited for so many years. The baby she believed would bring love back into her marriage. The baby she had protected with everything she had was gone. And the most painful part was that at the moment she lost her child. The husband who had once promised to protect her was not there. During the days that followed, Grace barely spoke to anyone. She lay silently in her hospital bed, staring out the window. Whenever she closed her eyes, she remembered that rainy night. She remembered knocking on the door in desperation. She remembered begging to be allowed to stay. And for the first time in her life, Grace stopped blaming herself. It was not because she was not good enough. It was not because she had not tried hard enough. Some people simply will never love you, no matter how much you sacrifice for them. The only person who stayed by her side during that time was an elderly woman named Evelyn. It was Evelyn who had found Grace sunk unconscious by the roadside and brought her to the hospital that night. Every day she came to visit. She did not ask many questions. She was not curious. She simply sat quietly beside her. One afternoon, when she saw Grace holding the ultrasound's picture and crying for the first time since waking up, Evelyn gently took her hand. "You can't live in this pain forever." Grace lowered her head. Tears fell onto the hand that was tightly clutching the picture. "I don't have anything left." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment before quietly replying, "No, you still have yourself." Those words stayed with Grace for many years afterward when she was discharged from the hospital. She stood outside the entrance for a long time. Michael's phone number was still in her pocket. One phone call and he would know where she was. One phone call and she could tell him everything that had happened. But in the end, Grace did not call. She did not send a message. She did not beg. She did not explain. Because for the first time, she understood that someone who truly loves you would never allow things to go this far. Grace disappeared from Michael's life as if she had never existed. The years that followed were filled with exhausting work. During the day, she worked as an office employee at night. She took management and business courses. There were days when she slept only a few hours before throwing herself back into work. Whenever she felt like giving up, she remembered the baby she had lost. She remembered that rainy night, and that pain became the force that pulled her back to her feet. Meanwhile, Evelyn quietly watched over her. Only then did Grace learn that the woman who had once saved her was far from ordinary. Evelyn was the owner of a major corporation with numerous subsidiaries operating across the country. What caught Evelyn's attention was not Grace's circumstances, it was her determination. A woman who could lose everything and still keep moving forward was not easy to find. One day, Evelyn called Grace into her office and placed a stack of documents in front of her. "I want to give you this opportunity." Grace looked down at the new business proposal. She lifted her head in surprise. "Why me?" Evelyn smiled. "Because people who have walked out of hell usually know how to build their own heaven." That opportunity changed Grace's life. She threw herself into her work with everything she had. Everything she had learned, experienced, and endured became an advantage. Her first project succeeded, then the second one. A few years later, Grace owned her own company, her own house, a stable life she had never even dared to dream of before. No one looked at her with pity anymore. No one called her a burden anymore. No one could ever throw her out of a house again. But while Grace's life was gradually entering its best chapter, everything in Michael's family was beginning to collapse. Margaret's business suffered one loss after another. The debts kept piling up. Unpaid bills became more frequent. Even the house she had once been so proud of was mortgaged to pay what she owed. And for the first time in many years, the woman who had once locked a door in Grace's face began to understand what it felt like to lose a sense of security. 6 years had passed since the rainy night that changed Grace's life forever. The city now knew her by an entirely different name. She was no longer the poor daughter-in-law who had been looked down upon, no longer the woman who had stood crying in the rain before a closed door. Grace was now the owner of a rapidly growing corporation, featured in business magazines and invited to speak at major conferences. People admired her strength, but no one knew that behind her calm smile was a rainy night she had never forgotten. Throughout those 6 years, Grace never contacted Michael, and Michael never knew what had truly happened on the night she disappeared, when he returned from that business trip years earlier. All he received was a cold explanation from his mother. Margaret told him Grace had left. She said Grace had grown tired of married life. She said Grace no longer wanted the baby. She said Grace had chosen to abandon the family. Michael was devastated, but in the end, he believed every word, partly because he trusted his mother too much, and partly because he had never imagined she was capable of something so cruel. Over the years, he tried many times to find Grace, but without success. Eventually, he forced himself to believe that she had chosen to leave. It was the only lie that allowed him to keep living. But the truth always finds a way to reveal itself when people least expect it. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents in preparation for selling the house that had been seized by the bank, Michael accidentally discovered an old file box hidden deep inside a storage room. Inside were documents he had never seen before. At first, he intended to ignore them, but an envelope from a hospital bearing Grace's name made him stop. Michael opened it. Just a few minutes later, his entire body began to tremble. Inside the file was a hospital admission report. From the very night Grace disappeared, it documented a high fever, severe exhaustion, and serious emotional trauma. But what nearly took his breath away was written on the final page, a statement confirming that the baby could not be saved. Michael read the document over and over as if his eyes were deceiving him. He turned the remaining pages. A social worker's report clearly stated that Grace had been found unconscious by the roadside during a heavy rainstorm. No family members were with her. No one visited her during the first days of her hospitalization. Michael collapsed onto the floor. Everything in his mind shattered. The child he believed had never been born. The wife he believed had left on her own. It had all been a lie, and for the first time in 6 years, he asked the question he should have asked long ago. What really happened that night? When Michael walked into the living room holding the file, Margaret immediately knew everything was over. He placed the documents on the table and looked at his mother with eyes she had never seen before. There was no respect left, no patience, only pain and anger. "What did you do to her?" Michael asked. Margaret tried to avoid his gaze. "It happened a long time ago, but Michael slammed the file onto the table." I asked, "What you did to her?" The room fell silent, and for the first time in years, Margaret could no longer lie. As the truth unfolded, Michael felt every word like a knife piercing his chest. He knew his mother disliked Grace, but he had never imagined she had thrown her out of the house while she was pregnant, running a high fever, and standing in the middle of a storm. He had never imagined that while he was sitting in a hotel preparing for a meeting the next day, the woman he loved was lying unconscious beside a road. That night, Michael sat alone in the darkness until sunrise. And for the first time in his life, he understood that his mother was not the only one who had betrayed Grace. He had betrayed her too, because every time Grace cried, he told her to let it go. Every time she was hurt, he chose silence. It was that silence that had led everything to this ending, but now it was too late to change anything. Over the past 6 years, Grace's life had only become better and better. Meanwhile, Michael's family had sunk deeper and deeper into crisis. Their business ventures failed one after another. The debts kept growing larger. Creditors called constantly. The house that had once been Margaret's greatest source of pride was eventually seized by the bank when the last people left. She finally understood how painful it was to lose the place you called home. And then, with no other choice left, Michael and Margaret came looking for Grace. Their old car stopped in front of a large mansion behind iron gates that stood more than 2 meters high. Margaret looked up at the house in disbelief. The daughter-in-law she had once looked down on was now living in a world she had never imagined Grace could reach. But what bothered her even more was that they were not allowed inside immediately. The security guard informed them that they would have to wait outside until Grace agreed to see them. Under the scorching midday sun, Margaret stood outside the gate for nearly an hour. An hour that felt longer than the 6 years that had passed. Finally, the gate slowly opened. Grace appeared on the front steps, calm and confident. She was no longer the fragile girl she had once been. No longer the woman who had silently cried through humiliation. Grace looked at the two people standing before her. For a long moment, her eyes settled on Margaret. Then she slowly walked down the steps. No one spoke. The air felt so heavy it was difficult to breathe. Then Grace finally broke the silence. "Do you remember that rainy night?" Margaret froze. Grace continued to look directly into her eyes. "The night you locked the door in my face?" Michael lowered his head. His entire body trembled, but Grace was not finished. Her voice was calm in a way that felt terrifying. "I remember every second of it." Both of them stood motionless because they realized that some wounds cannot be erased by time, and some rainy nights, even after 6 years, continue to live inside the memory of the person who was left behind. No one spoke after Grace's words. A cold wind swept across the large courtyard, carrying with it a suffocating heaviness. Margaret stood motionless in front of her. The woman who had once always carried herself with pride and authority now looked much older. 6 years earlier, she had held the keys to the house. She had been the one who decided who could stay and who had to leave. But today, everything had changed. She no longer had that house, no longer had the business she had once been proud of, no longer had the relatives who used to surround her when the family was prosperous. The only thing she had left was regret that had come far too late. Margaret's lips trembled then. For the first time since entering the property, she broke down in tears. The pride was gone. The bitterness was gone. All that remained was a woman who had lost almost everything. Grace. Her voice cracked. "I know I was wrong." Grace did not respond. She simply stood there, looking at the woman before her with calm eyes. Margaret took a deep breath and continued, "I've thought about that night so many times. Tears rolled down her face. If I could go back, I would never do it." Grace remained silent, not because she did not hear her, but because some apologies arrived too late. Some wounds no longer need explanations. Margaret took another step forward. "Please." Her voice nearly broke apart. "Please help the family this time." It was the first time in her life she had spoken to Grace in a pleading tone, the daughter-in-law she had once treated like an unwanted burden. The woman she had once asked what she could possibly bring to the family. And now she was the one standing before Grace, begging for a chance. Michael stood beside her, watching everything. He had never seen his mother like this, and it made him understand even more clearly what Grace had endured all those years ago. A long silence followed. Margaret waited. Michael waited too. Perhaps they both believed Grace would soften, that enough time had passed, that she already had everything, that someone as successful as she was would easily help them out of their troubles. But they failed to understand one thing. Forgiving someone and returning to save the people who destroyed your life are two completely different things. Grace looked at Margaret for a long time. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, not angry. There was not a trace of satisfaction in it, and that calmness made every word heavier than any scream could ever be. That night, I knocked on the door for a very long time. Margaret lowered her head. Tears continued to fall. Grace looked directly at her. "I begged you to open it." Her voice remained steady, as if she were telling someone else's story, but only she knew how much her heart had suffered. "I told you I had nowhere to go." Michael closed his eyes, because now he could finally picture it all. His wife, pregnant, burning with a fever, standing in the freezing rain, alone, with no one to help her, no one to protect her, Grace continued. "But you chose to lock it." No one said a word. Only the sound of the wind moving through the vast garden remained. Then Grace gave a slight nod, as if she had finally spoken the words she had carried in her heart for 6 years. "Today I'm simply respecting your decision." Margaret broke down in tears because for the first time she understood how painful rejection truly was. Not through hatred, not through insults, but through the consequences of her own actions. At that moment, Michael finally stepped forward. His eyes were red. The man who had so often said, "Don't take it personally," could no longer find a single excuse for himself. He looked at Grace as though he were looking at the woman he had lost long ago. "I'm sorry," his voice was hoarse. Grace said nothing. Michael took a deep breath and continued, "For 6 years. I believed you had left." He lowered his head. "But the truth is I was the one who abandoned you." Tears began to form in his eyes. "I failed to protect you." It was the sentence Grace had wished to hear many years ago. On the nights she cried alone, during the times she was humiliated in front of others, in the moment she stood beneath the rain, knocking on a locked door. But now those words could not change anything. Grace looked at Michael. There was no anger left inside her, no love either, only the peace of someone who had finally moved beyond the past. "Some doors only close once," she said softly. "And some things once lost can never be brought back." Michael lowered his head. He understood. At last he truly understood. But just like his mother, he understood too late. A few minutes later, Grace turned and walked back toward the mansion. No one stopped her. No one called her name. Margaret stood there watching her with tear-filled eyes. Michael did the same. The large doors slowly opened. Before Grace, she stepped inside. Then the iron gates behind her slowly closed. At that exact moment, the first raindrops began to fall. Margaret remained outside. alone, soaked beneath the cold rain, almost in the exact same place where Grace had stood 6 years earlier, with only one difference. Back then, Grace still hoped someone would open the door for her. Today, Margaret knew no one would open it. The most painful thing is not losing a good person. The most painful thing is realizing their value when it is already too late. If this story made you think, leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.